Good afternoon, Gwen.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Hall.
Well, okay, but it's so great to see you again. It's been so long since we've seen each other, and we go way back, don't we?
Yes, we do. I think it's actually 25 years.
That's right.
25 years, and they're in Louisiana, and at a time when there was no interpretation of slavery.
That's right.
On the River Road.
None. Yeah.
None, as you can recall, as I can recall.
They didn't talk about it. Didn't talk about them. And they just talked about the slave-owning families and glorifying them, like Gone with the Wind style.
I want you to give us your full name and your birth date.
Okay, my name is Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, and I was born June 27th, 1929, in New Orleans.
Can you tell me something about your parents?
Okay. My father was born in Europe, in a section that's called Upper Silesia, which was at that time part of the Russian Empire, but it's now part of Poland. So it used to make life complicated.
So what year was your father born?
He was born in 1902.
And what year was your mother born?
1909.
And where was your mother from?
My mother was born in Chicago, but she moved to Donaldsonville when she was 3 years old, and she stayed there until she married my father, which was in 1926.
I know you have many books that you have written. Can you tell us how many books have you published?
Well, okay, books I've published, I'll have to you want it offhand, or you want
just the count? Just the count. About how many books have you published?
I guess about 6.
About 6.
That doesn't include the database.
So I noticed the one that I met you, which was just published in the mid-1990s.
No, it was early 1990s.
Early 1990s.
I think it was published in 1992.
Okay. And I met you in about 1994 or 93.
Right.
Just before.
And I remember sitting on the Mississippi levee with you talking about your plan.
And I want to thank you for encouraging me to continue my pursuit of opening the River Road African American Museum. And of course, my career now has led to quite a bit of research and following your research and with the database and several of your books. And I just want to say on behalf of all of my museum colleagues across the country, but particularly my museum colleagues from the West Baton Rouge Museum down to New Orleans, we want to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that the warm reception that I have gotten from the museum community.
Yes. So let's get back to some of the more interesting points about your life. Tell me, where did you grow up?
I grew up in uptown New Orleans. You know, I lived in 3 different places in uptown New Orleans.
Where was your favorite residence in New Orleans?
I think the first house I remember, which was on corner of Peniston and Robinson Street.
Do you remember the address?
I don't.
Tell me something about where you attended school. I mean, from the very first school, yes.
Okay, first school I attended was Woodrow Wilson Elementary School in uptown New Orleans. And that's where I learned that where we all had to give the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning while we were raising the flag. Mm-hmm. And where I was in 6th grade when they started teaching Louisiana history, they and the history of the United States, they talked about our founding fathers and how they made such great sacrifices and how brave they were to ensure freedom or liberty. They used the word liberty. And I had seen no evidence of any of this growing up, you know? And so I asked my teacher, what is liberty? And she said, she laughed, and she said, oh, you'll find out after you grow up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any difference in the way teachers answer that question today to
I don't
students.
know. I imagine, yeah, there has to be.
Yes. So, Woodrow Wilson was the elementary school?
That was the name of the elementary school.
And so,
Went through 7th grade. We skipped it. There was no 8th grade to go to. Then I went from there to McMain High School. My first year of high school. And that was just terrible. Because this teacher spent all that time talking about how inferior black people were and how they were smelly and dirty and why didn't they bathe and they were violent and they were criminals, and that the only way to keep them in place was to repress, heavy repression. They talked about the 1795 conspiracy in Pompey Parish.
they did.
It was in the textbook.
Yes.
And they said that the cause of it was that these black men wanted to rape all of the white women. And that's why they had to cut their heads off and put them on poles along the Mississippi River. And that's what the textbook said.
And so in high school, was that the first time that you heard the word conspiracy in relation to enslaved people?
No. I mean, yes. In high school, yes. That was because we were taught that, first of all, that slaves loved slavery. They loved their masters. They were very content and happy. And it was just these terrible Yankees who stirred them up.
So I know as I've read a little bit about your life, your father had a big impact and influence on your profession today.
Yeah.
Can you tell me something about what was your father's job when you were in high school, and what was his impact on your life?
Okay, well, my father had an extremely difficult childhood. And he was the 14th of 16 children, my grandmother, in Poland, what is now Poland. And they were extremely poor, and the Jewish working class was terribly exploited, and they were really starved. And he had rickets. He was born with a very bad case of rickets because of malnutrition. And his mother had to she felt she had to decide which children got the food. And he was eliminated because she decided to give the food to the children who had the best possibility of survival. And so I had an aunt who loved him very much, and she shared her food with him. And that's how he survived.
And so when did he come to the Americas?
They arrived right in January of... Okay, they went from Poland. Okay. The older brother was very active in the revolution against the Tsar, to overthrow the Tsar in 1905.
Mm-hmm.
And it was said that revolutionary literature was hidden in my father's diaper and crib.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone in the family said, remarked on that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know this until recently, but they were either members or supporters of the Jewish labor movement. And I didn't know what it was. I thought it was some kind of Zionist organization in Poland between the two world wars or something like that. And I heard my aunt talk about it with respect. I was absolutely wrong. They were anti-Zionist. They were anti-religious, but they were culturally Jews. They valued the Yiddish language as the language that was spoken by the Jews, and they were Marxists. So they organized study groups, and they would read translations of Marx into Yiddish. And so they would read them to each other and discuss them and explain them. They organized a labor movement, first labor movement. And there were strikes in the city where my father grew up. I mean, not where he was born anyway.
So what year did they come to America?
Okay, first of all, they had to leave because of the 1905 revolution was destroyed. So they left in 1907. First, they lived in Germany, right outside of Frankfurt, until they had to leave again because the World War I was about to break out, and they didn't have it. The Germans were looking at immigration papers, and so they were some of the first people, I guess, that you would call undocumented immigrants, right?
So then they called them undocumented immigrants that came into America?
I don't know what they called them. I'm just calling them that.
So coming from Germany, what was the first city that they arrived in, your first family?
New Orleans.
It went directly to New Orleans.
And that was very unusual because almost all the Jews went to New York and came to Ellis Island. Some of them spread out to the Midwest, all the way to Chicago, like my mother's family did. But there was a very strong revolutionary tradition among almost all the Jews who came, because most of them were pretty, poverty stricken. And in the States, it was not very good. I mean, they were working in the garment industry in New York, also in Chicago. They were paid nothing. My father said that when they lived in Chicago for a little while, he and his entire family were paid one salary of $5 a week.
Why, or did you ever ask your father why they chose Louisiana?
I know.
Why did they choose Louisiana?
Okay. In 1910, the oldest son and one of the sons-in-law went to New York City to pave the way for the family to come. So they operated it. Everybody moved together. You don't leave anybody behind. And they came to see, smooth things out and find a place to stay and jobs and stuff. They came back and they said, we don't want to go there. He said, conditions were so horrible.
Speaking of New York.
New York City,
Okay.
yeah. He said, we have to go somewhere else. So when their ship arrived, they just stayed on the ship, and I think it arrived in New York. They came in on 3 different ships, the whole family. And the ships arrived in New York, then they went all the way down the Gulf Coast, all the way to Galveston. And they were supposed to work in Galveston, but there was no work. So instead they were told, yes, there's work in New Orleans. And so they ended up in New Orleans. Now another story is that my father's family was told they had a cousin who owned a restaurant in New Orleans. And that was the track. That was somehow in theory, but they never found the cousin.
So what was your father's first job, I understand that he became an attorney, a civil rights attorney. What was his first job when he, as a young person, then how did he become an attorney?
Okay.
And where did he go to school?
All right. Now, all of my family, both my mother's and my father's side, they were all tailors. And that was not too unusual. A lot of Jews in Eastern Europe were tailors. And so they did their own work. You know, they didn't hire out. You know, they were small scale tailors. And if they didn't want to work for these big companies that really exploited them, gave them nothing. So they finally decided to open a tailor shop in South Rampart Street. And that was the center of shopping for African Americans and also music. Because African Americans were not allowed to shop in department stores downtown or anywhere else. There were just very restricted stores where they could buy anything. And in New Orleans, it was mostly Jewish small businessmen who opened these stores, who served African Americans.
And so again, what made your father, or how did he pay? Well, you kind of explained maybe how he was able to pay for law school, but what
I didn't explain.
You did, but can you tell us what made him want to become a civil rights attorney?
Okay. Well, first of all, his oldest brother was Dr. Charles Midler. And even when they were in Germany, his teacher said he had such talent for medicine, even when he was a little child. He begged the family to leave him. And he said, I'll treat him like my son, and I'll raise him, and I'll educate him, and I'll keep in touch with you about how he's doing. And the family refused it. They said promised him they would pool all their resources to send him to medical school. So, but the family felt that my father was not the one with the brains. It was his older son. And my father was supposed to support his brother to get him through medical school. And meanwhile, my father got married, and my sister was born in 1927. So he had responsibility for his family, for sending his brother through medical school. And then both of his parents got sick at the same time and couldn't provide for themselves. So he took both of his parents into his home and took care of them till they died. And meanwhile, my mother was pregnant with me, and they both died while she was pregnant with me, and I was named after both of them.
So again, why do you think your father had such a strong interest in becoming a civil rights attorney?
All right. First of all, he insisted that he would not take responsibility for the tailor shop unless he was allowed to go back to school. So he went to McDonough number 35 for elementary school and high school. And when he was in high school, one of his teachers told him, "You're a very good debater. You should go to law school." And so he said yes, he was going to go to law school. He went to Loyola Law School at night. And it did, tuition wasn't that much in those days. And so he was working all day, going to law school at night. But when he opened this, I think he passed the bar in 1927. He opened an office in 1930, which was nobody had any money, And so his clients, he chose clients based on the value, the importance of their case. And he didn't care if they paid him or not. My mother was ready to kill him. But his clients did the best they could. One of his clients once left some live geese in the bathtub in our house as a compensation for not paying him. And when we walked to the front door, the geese attacked us. So that was my mother's. She says, that's what your free alley clients do. Okay, well, in the 1930s, the labor movement was getting off the ground. And the CIO, which was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was being organized in New Orleans. And the repression was just unbelievable. You know, we used to take some of their organizers across the state line to Mississippi to help them be safe. And they would tell us stories about how if they were on the street, every cop would be taught, look at these people, these labor organizers, you go out and you arrest them and beat them up in jail to drive them out of town. And they, you know, some of them they were injured so badly that they couldn't keep going. But a lot of them kept going and kept organizing. And the CIO in New Orleans turned out to be the most black labor organizations in the country because of the waterfront.
And so your father also worked with A.P. Turo.
Yes, he did. In fact, he helped A.P. Turo get his notarial commission because he was denied this commission for years. And meanwhile, before he got it, all of A.P. Turo's clients were brought to my father's office every evening to get their documents notarized. And he used to come to our house for dinner. And some of my father's friends would walk in and just practically faint to see an African American sitting at our dining room table. He brought him to his synagogue once, services, and it was an endless scandal. But he got involved in this, you know, because he really cared about people, and he never cared about money. He was not at all into, buying stuff and acting important. You know, he was not made that way.
So I heard you say that you were born in New Orleans. Your father had rickets. I remember you telling me when you were born something about food. You couldn't eat.
Oh yes, I couldn't eat until I was about 7 or 8 years old. I mean, I couldn't stand food. It made me nauseous. If I ate food, I'd throw it up. And my mother was desperate because I was really skinny, you know, and undernourished. So
how did you get over that?
Because we went to, again, the same rich aunt. She had a place in Covington for the summer. And so we were invited to go there, and we spent a little time there, and I just fell in love with nature, you know, with critters and birds and trees and pine needles and the river, which was a beautiful, clean river then. You can hear it now.
Mm-hmm.
And beautiful sand beaches, and you know, I was just so happy to be there. I had no idea that such a place existed.
What would you say became your favorite food? The first, you said you were kind of rejecting food.
The only thing I could eat was butter. So I used to eat sticks of butter.
Well, that helped fatten you up.
Yeah, I think that kept me going those years too.
Well, okay, so
wait, let me say more about my father.
Yes,
he became the best lawyer in the state to get people who were put in jail, wrongfully incarcerated people out of jail. So he was on a retainer from the CIO, $100 a month, and his job was to get all their organizers out of jail wherever they were.
And so how old were you then, would you say?
Oh, maybe 7 or 8. And this is how my father taught me to be a revolutionary, because he told me about all of these terrible conditions. I mean, he wasn't abstract, he wasn't talking about socialism or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was show and tell. He'd show me documents. I mean, when I was a little bitty kid, he'd show me photographs. He'd bring his clients home to talk to us, to tell us what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up with that. And it was, in a lot of ways, it was alienating for me, because I saw a side of life that nobody else saw. And so I thought people were all crazy, that they didn't know. And so I would try to tell them, and they didn't want to hear it. Or they, thought this dismissed me as this crazy child,
Who would you say was your first African American friend?
Alvin Jones. Alvin B. Jones.
And where did you meet Alvin?
Well, I helped organize the only interracial youth movement in the South. I helped organize it in 1945, and I met Alvin there. And we became very close friends. And Alvin's father was a mailman, and I used to go to his house, and he would just be ranting and raving against Alvin. Why? Because he said that Alvin should be satisfied with his life, and that he should be a mailman like him.
And what did Alvin want to become?
Alvin was a political activist and the labor organizer. He organized at Higgins Shipyard.
At Higgins Shipyard.
When I met him, he was dodging the goon squads at Higgins Shipyard. And he did study law. When Louisiana was forced to offer law school education to African Americans, Southern University in Baton Rouge opened up this first class for law students. It was 5 students sitting in a library. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. No.
Yes. He was one of the 5 students. And he was really brilliant and very dedicated politically. And he had a very bad end.
And so he was from New Orleans.
Yes.
He was from New Orleans. You were lifelong friends? Is Alvin still living, as far as you know?
Unfortunately, he drank himself to death. That was a Red Scare. He was so persecuted by the FBI. He had too much integrity. I mean, even his people who he associated with politically, they were not really too honest about certain things. But he was out to protect his clients. And that's all that counted for. This was a Civil Rights Congress I'm talking about. And he there was 2 black guys who were accused of coming out of a car, going into a house, and raping a black woman. And they made this a big cause. And one of them, they told them finally that one of them had actually done this. The other one sat in the car and knew nothing about it. And so Alvin had the guilty man confess and had the charges dropped against the man who was innocent. And the Civil Rights Congress never forgave him. And that's what Alvin was like.
So where did you go to college?
I first went to Newcomb College at Tulane University, which was a horrible experience. I was there for 2 years. I got a major in American history and another major in European history. I had senior status because I went to summer school to get this over with because I couldn't stand it. I mean, they were teaching racism just like every school I went to. I went to, and after my first year of high school, my mother sent me to Newman High School. And it was not much better school, but I still got the racist propaganda much more detached in style, but it was the same thing.
So, did you experience any discrimination because you were Jewish, and because did people know that your family was Jewish? Was
Yeah.
that a part of the discrimination that you experienced?
Yes, it was. I mean, even elementary school, my sister was asked to leave the room so that the teacher could make anti-Semitic remarks. She told her that. And then during the Spanish Civil War, which was 1936 through 39, right?
Mhm.
The Spanish loyalists, I didn't understand a lot about it then, but my family supported the Spanish loyalists. In New Orleans, it was rough because the Catholic Church supported Franco, and New Orleans was 70% Catholic in those days, and so the teachers were all supporting Franco.
So, I suppose this next question, this may lead right into my next question, maybe. Why so much interest about African and African American history? Why? What for you?
Okay, because I was raised with horrible stories about violence against whites, and I mean, I remember my father's cases. One case was a black man who was shot in the stomach 10 times Saturday night by a policeman. And my father sued to have the city. He had 10 children to support, totally disabled. And my father sued the city for compensation, and he lost. And I just pounded on the walls. And these were the stories that I grew up with.
So after Newcomb, where did you go? Where did you get your master's, your PhD?
That came much later in my life. It was when I returned to, I went to Mexico, and I got my MA. I got my BA and my MA at Mexico City College. And then a few years later, I went to University of Michigan
And that's where
for
you
my
got your-
PhD.
At what age did you get married? And would you tell us something about your husband?
Honey, you came up with the singular. You have to come up with plurals when it comes to marriage.
I was going to let you take us into that part of this
All
discussion.
right. My first marriage was when I was 16. And I had loved, this was a man who I had loved all my life, as long as I could remember. And he was 5 years older than I, and he was also my second cousin. And my parents threw a complete fit. It was so bad that my father beat me constantly for months, until I finally picked up a footstool and threw it across the room and hit him in the nose. And he said to my mother, "Ethel, she hit me," but he never hit me again. And that put a terrible strain on my feelings for my father. I never got over it.
So
I
did
never could mourn for him after he died.
So did you move out? You moved out of the house at 16?
Yes, indeed. And then we both joined the Communist Party of New Orleans.
And what year was
That
that?
was 1946.
And then you had a second husband.
Well, wait, don't leave me yet. Okay, that was when I was most active politically,
Yes.
and that was a terrific thing. That was when I went to the Southern Negro Youth Congress, Southern Youth Legislature, and I sat behind W.E.B. Du Bois on the stage when he gave his Behold the Land speech. And Herbert Aptheker spoke there too. And he had just recently published his book about Negro slave revolts. And he talked about the slave revolts. And I was so astounded because I'd never heard anything like this before, about African American
Yes,
history.
yes.
And that made me determined to become a historian.
So you were married to your first husband at that time.
Yeah.
And so when you heard W.E.B. Du Bois, you were in New York then?
No, I was in New Orleans.
He was in New Orleans?
No. Du Bois?
Yes.
No, this was in Columbia, South Carolina. We went there in 2 cars with the interracial group, and we couldn't use the bathroom anyway.
Mm-hmm. And then you went home to New Orleans.
Went home to New Orleans.
How long did your first marriage last?
About 1.5 years. And he got frustrated about a number of things, which was, it was a complicated situation. And he insisted that he was going to leave New Orleans, move out of our apartment, and if I wanted to go with him, good, and if not, he's going to go by himself.
So how old were you then?
I'm 17.
Jeez.
And so, I really loved him very much. But I couldn't, he wanted to go up to Texas and start his own tailor shop. And I could not stand the idea of being the wife of a small Jewish businessman in Texas for the rest of my life. I just could not swallow it. And so I left him in Austin. And after that I won't say I met. My second husband was a classical pianist. And we had the same piano teacher when we were children. I met him at a music quiz that the teachers had organized for their students. And one of the questions was the instruments of a string quartet. And he answered it wrong, and I answered it right. And he was so infuriated. He said, I answered it wrong, and she got the right answer, and she's a girl. Well, that was, that marriage was very costly to me in so many ways. And that's too much to go into here.
Is it in your memoirs?
Yes.
A little bit more of it?
Oh, a lot more. A lot more of it. But we did spend 4 years in Paris, supported by my parents. And I was never that good as a performing musician.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to get my parents to pay for us as long as possible in Paris, my husband talked me into switching from history to classical music. And that was costly to me too. And that was probably with my getting a degree in history in France. But that's where he wanted to be, and he wouldn't leave. And so finally, after 4 years, I came back. But I did get a lot out of Paris, and I got a lot out of being in the world of music. I mean, I do have some talent, substantial talent for music. I mean, I can hear every note.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a good critic. But I was not a good.
So growing up in New Orleans and having this background in classical music, but certainly being surrounded by jazz.
Yes.
I'm sure you met many of the jazz musicians.
Well,
can
we
you
used
tell us
to,
that?
at the New Orleans Youth Council, we used to go all over town together, and we'd go to the clubs, go to the music clubs, and all over town. There was a lot of the downtown section in New Orleans. We used to go to this famous one. What was the most famous? Dewdrop Inn.
Oh, the Dewdrop Inn.
Yes,
Yes.
we went to the Dewdrop Inn together to hear the latest.
Mm-hmm. Who was your favorite jazz musician in your 20s?
When I was in my 20s, I guess I liked Louis Armstrong.
Did you ever meet him?
No.
Never met. we just opened an exhibit at the West Baton Rouge Museum about juke joints. It's a juke joint exhibit.
Right.
And, from my research, juke joints are typically places in rural communities.
Yeah.
You traveled through rural communities, I'm sure,
Yeah.
throughout your lifetime traveling with your father and your husbands. Can you tell us anything about, were you allowed to go into a juke joint as a Jewish young woman? Can you recall anything about juke joints?
Black ones?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think often whites were allowed to go into black clubs, but blacks weren't allowed to go into white clubs.
Mm-hmm.
But, not many. Oh, I mean, during my first husband, we used to go to the Coliseum Arena in New Orleans. You know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, God, you have to learn about that.
Okay.
We sat in the white balcony, and there were there was competitions there
Mm-hmm.
of dance compositions.
Mm.
What was the name of the dances in those days?
Oh, I suppose it must have been Jitterbug.
Exactly.
Yes.
There were jitterbug competitions, just sensational dancing.
So they had a white balcony
Yes.
and a black club.
Yes.
So
And
you
it was more
observed.
than a club, it was an auditorium, it was a huge place. Just hundreds and hundreds of people dancing.
Did you ever go to the Pythian Theater? Do you ever remember going to the Pythian?
The Pythian Theater.
Mm-hmm.
Where was that?
Oh gosh, I don't know the exact address, but it's really, they've remodeled it, restored it. Just in the last few weeks, it has reopened with housing and apartments upstairs and a marketplace downstairs. But I was just wondering if you might have known anything or been there before. In traveling across the South, well, I remember seeing something in one of the chapters of your memoirs that you taught self-defense against the KKK in North Carolina.
Yes, I did.
How did that come to be?
Okay, well, this was when I was I was just fed up in New York and scared to death of the movement there because there were all kinds of provocateurs who were talking about blowing up the Statue of Liberty, and they'd be coming to our apartment and talking about things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I needed to get away.
Mm-hmm.
And so my friend her name's Carolyn Dejois,
Mm-hmm.
and she was arrested with us when we were arrested for having an interracial party in 1949.
Where?
French Quarter. And she was arrested with us. That's another whole story.
Oh my goodness.
I can't begin to get into that. But it's an interesting story.
Is it in your memoir?
Yes, it's all in there.
Okay.
There's even clippings, newspaper clippings about it. So anyway, she came to visit me and she said that there was this rural black college in North Carolina called the Elizabeth City State College.
Mm-hmm.
And that they had lost their history teacher and they couldn't find anybody to replace him on short notice, and that nobody wanted to go to such a remote place to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, that sounds like, this was 1965,
My goodness. Yes.
So I went there for an interview, I was accepted. John Henry Clark wrote me an enthused letter of recommendation,
Yes.
which gave him trouble with the FBI. I saw his FBI files
Yes.
later.
Hmm.
And I started teaching there. I had never taught before. And I started lecturing, and the students were sitting there with their hands up with their pencils looking like, what in the world does this woman say?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I stopped. I said, I'm not telling you, you're not understanding what I'm saying. I said, no. So I said, okay, let's start over. And so I started learning how to teach. They had sixth grade reading level. And they were really beat down because all of the professors there were just talking about how terrible the students were, and they didn't count how stupid they were. They had no spark of life, you know. And after I was teaching for a while, we had to close all the windows and doors because it was so animated. I learned how to teach them well. I used to do a lot of essay exams and correct their essay exams. Tell them about words. You know, we would talk. I really talk mostly about words.
And so, but you were there to teach history, and you
I
ended
thought
up
it was.
teaching, of course, English and probably.
Well, but you know, history is the whole world. You know? So I would teach them things like, what does paternalism mean? I'd ask a question like that, and then sometimes I would raise a question, and then close a discussion, and the students would say, "But what's the answer? What's the answer?" I said, "Well, there's a lot of questions that don't have any answers," and they would say, "You know, this really inspired them because they were taught to memorize and
Answers,
beat
yeah.
it back, and that was what they were taught." Which is pretty useless.
So how did the self-defense class come
Okay,
about?
when I started seeing the Ku Klux Klan organizing, I'd go into town, and I had 2 black kids and myself, and so there would be cars with Confederate flag traits parading in the middle of town or blowing their horns, and so I didn't say much to the student. I said very little. Just the last day of class, we were talking about the contemporary civil rights movement. And that was after Selma. And the school closed down and just showed pictures of live photos of the Selma March. And so I said, you know, the Ku Klux Klan is organizing. And there's 2 ways of dealing, 2 different ideas of how you deal with the Ku Klux Klan. I said there's Dr. Martin Luther King, who believes in absolute nonviolence. And there's a man from North Carolina named Robert F. Williams, who lives a little bit further south from here, or he lived here. That was after he was in Cuba. And here's the name of his book. I put Negroes with Guns on the board. That's all I said. They fought the Ku Klux Klan for years. They and some other students from other black colleges. They finally drove them out of East North Carolina in 1969. That took them 4 years. And I didn't even know about it till I went to Robert Williams' funeral. And there was a historian there who was studying the state police archives because nobody said anything about it. It was just blacked out because they didn't want to encourage others to do it.
So basically, you taught them about who Robert F. Williams was, and that
I didn't even say that much about him. I mean, I didn't say anything about the armed self-defense more than about. Couldn't have been 5 minutes because that's the way I closed the course. And the students came back in the summer and signed up for my courses, and they said Robert F. Williams' way works.
So that's a chapter in your memoirs.
Yes, I talk about the whole community and what was going on there.
So you mentioned, we talked about husband number 1, husband number 2, and then I heard you just say that you had 2 biracial children. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about, there was a husband number 3, and if you want to say or tell us about your children,
Okay,
please,
well, of
please
course,
do.
it's related to my child from the second marriage. My son Leo, who's now 67 years old, and by some miracles still alive.
Mhm.
Because my second husband went to court and got custody of my son
Mhm.
in the city of New York. And I was given such limited visiting rights that I had no more relationship with him. And then we moved to Mexico, and I would send him a Christmas present and a birthday present once a year, and I'd get a one-line thank you note from him. And that was my relationship with him.
Do you mind telling us the name of your
My
husband?
son, oh yes, Harry Hager.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I left Michelle for him. I left my second husband for him. And we had a child very quickly, who was the one you met.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I had a daughter after that, a few years later.
And so there's a chapter in your memoirs, and raising biracial children in the bad old days is the name of that chapter.
Uh-huh.
And I can't wait to read it.
It's very depressing. You know, that's the most depressing chapter in there, I think.
That's the most depressing chapter for you.
I think so. Most painful experience.
Well, I'm going to read it. I'm not going to ask you to share anything from that chapter with us. Yeah. But I'm going to read that chapter, and I'm certainly.
Let me just say this much, okay, about my oldest son.
Mm-hmm.
I was preparing for my prelims at University of Michigan, my PhD, and I got a phone call from him. And he says, "This is Leo. I am your son. My mind has been expanding, and I want to come visit you." So he arrived with a loaded pistol, completely paranoid and out of it, and with drugs and all kinds of stuff. And here I was 2 younger children. And Haywood said, "Let's go, look, we'll go into the basement and shoot these bullets into some soft wood." And then Haywood took the gun and got rid of it. But that was the beginning, you know.
And that was Haywood, your husband,
No, my son.
Your older son. Your younger son, Haywood, took
He was
Leo.
about 12 years old.
Oh my goodness, yes. Mm-hmm.
So he's been like that, all his life.
I've had an opportunity to meet Haywood. Can you tell us what he does today?
Yes. He is one of the handful of international emergency medicine specialists who are widely acclaimed. And he has done a great deal to improve the emergency medical care in Mexico. He's saved many, many lives. He's trained thousands of people, medical people at all levels. And he keeps advancing with new technology, and he's now developed a way of delivering medical treatment to people no matter how remote they are or how poor they are, and it's quality medicine.
Yeah, he was telling us about the work with obstetrics and midwives, and also defibrillators here in Mexico, and it's just really, really very exciting to hear that you have a son who's so prominent in the work that he's doing.
Yeah, well, I'm very proud of him.
Yes,
as you can imagine, and he's been very good to me, very caring, and he's married to a wonderful Mexican woman. Mm-hmm. She has 2 sons from former marriage, and we all live together in this nice family compound. And her mother is very close to me. Mm-hmm. She comes anytime I need her. Mm-hmm. my daughter-in-law calls her and she comes.
Well, I want to say that you certainly have a multicultural family,
Yeah.
and it should be an inspiration for people around the world to know. I mean, how old are you, Gwen? Would you say?
This month I will be 89 years old.
So you've seen a lot happen in the history of the world, and
I certainly have.
seen a lot happen in the history of America,
Yeah.
and certainly read in reading your work, very, very tragic history,
Yes.
world history, American history as it relates to slavery.
Yeah.
But I want to say thank you again, because there's so much in your research about the resistors
Right.
and the freedom seekers.
Right.
And they were more than just runaways. And thank you so much for sharing this research with us.
Yeah. Well, what the important part of my research is studying documents, because historians have all kinds of ideas about what happened, but they don't look at what the people, and it's the people who are an inspiration.
Okay, 2 of those people in the documents that you shared with us, Pierre, Belle,
Yeah.
and Rose.
Right.
Seeing that document with that story, can you just tell us what your feelings were when you first read it, and then just tell us a little bit about Pierre and Rose?
Okay. Well, actually, I first heard about them from Ulysse Ricard, who worked with me on the database for the first year until he got sick and went blind, and that's another sad story. He died a few years later. But he published an article about that. And then when I was looking through the documents in that parish, I found new things that I don't think anybody realized. And it seems that Rose was an African woman who Pierre Belle bought off of a slave trade ship. She was a Yoruba. She was called Nago in Louisiana. And they became lovers. She had a number of children with him. He said he emancipated the children first, and then finally he emancipated Rose. And then he donated all of his possessions to her, much, much land and a whole bunch of slaves. And then after he died, some of his relatives from France showed up. And they said, well, we are forced heirs under the law, and some of this belongs to us. And so Rose had her son negotiating with the heirs, and they paid her off. They paid the Roses and her family, their children, off a nice sum of money, so that they would not make no further claims against his estate. Well, there was no estate because Belle had already given all of his property to Rose before he died.
Wow. And there seems to be cases referenced in your book, Africans in Colonial Louisiana, and as I've done research in courthouses over the years, of African people suing their masters.
Oh, yes.
Their owners. And it's just remarkable to me. Is there any, why do you think that's so frequent in Louisiana? How did that happen?
Okay. It was frequent in Spanish Louisiana. First of all, the Spanish outlawed enslavement of Native Americans. Not because they were kind-hearted, but because they were dying out. And so they were trying to protect them so they wouldn't disappear altogether and they'd have nobody to do the work. So they brought in Africans to do the most dangerous jobs. And according to slave law, the child follows the status of the mother. And so if any slaves in Spanish Louisiana could prove that they were descended from a Native American woman, then they had the right to be freed. And so there were a whole bunch of cases like that. Now, also in Spanish law, and especially in Spanish Louisiana, Spain had a very slim hold over the colony, even though they were supposed to be running it. It was not an easy place to run. And so they were afraid of the colonists. They thought, well, maybe we can side with the slaves so that we have some support from below. And they had, the Spanish had laws in which they drag up the ones they wanted to use and forget about the ones they didn't want to use. But they did have laws allowing for slaves to come to the governor or his appointees to bring complaints against the masters for not obeying slave law. And a lot of them did that. And there were a lot of interesting ones from Point Coupé, right?
Yes. Speaking of Point Coupé, you spent quite a bit of time there going through the court records and the conspiracy. There were two conspiracies in Point Coupé. Can you, first of all, tell us what is a conspiracy and what years they happened, and just whatever you might like to briefly tell us about that?
Okay. A conspiracy was a group of meetings among groups of slaves to decide that they were going to overthrow slavery. And so there were two major, there were more than two. In French Louisiana, very early, there was the Samba Bambara conspiracy, which was wiped out. And then the 1791 conspiracy of the Mina slaves. And again, in Point Coupé, there was a 1795 conspiracy to overthrow the slave system. And I write about that, both of these conspiracies at some length. But after I wrote it, I found some even more interesting things about it in documents. But they were, as I said, in school, when they talked about it, they just did all of these stereotypes about black men wanting to rape white women.
Not that they wanted to be free. Nothing about freedom.
No, just the desire to rape white women.
And now, what we know about these freedom seekers and resistors is that these are stories of the Underground Railroad.
Okay, we left out 1911.
1811?
I mean,
1811, yes.
That was the biggest slave conspiracy in history, and nobody knows anything about it. No talks about it.
And these, as I was saying, are stories of the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad is more than just people. It's about self-emancipation.
Of course, there's the San Malo story, about the slaves creating communities in the cypress swamps and sending people into the city to trade and buy what they needed, and how persistent it was that the slaves continued to escape into the cypress swamps. There's just in my database, I haven't even studied it yet.
Yes.
About the numbers of slaves. Just huge numbers of runaways. And they weren't easy to catch either. And not in Louisiana, a lot of them they were just gone.
Just gone, free.
Sometimes they would be listed on an inventory and they'd say, runaways, no value. Because they weren't expecting to catch it.
Well, I'm just so excited. Angelique Bergeron and I, from West Baton Rouge, representing the West Side parishes of Louisiana, that have a long, deep history. Yes. Spanish, French, African, and indigenous. And we're just so grateful that you've allowed us to come and look at these files and these records and share them so that we can share them with the public and with young people who need to hear these stories, you know.
Yes, you see, they were not known, mainly because people didn't look at stuff like that. But there was a language barrier too, because they're in French and Spanish.
Do you think that's why there's been so little history written about Louisiana and slavery?
Yes.
Because of that language?
Yes. You know, professional historians, it's not just that they're lazy, and a lot of them are lazy, but they have to publish, you know, and they survive in their profession in advance based on how many pages they publish each year. And if you do this stuff, you can't publish a lot of pages each year. And there were not many people like me who didn't care. You know, I got tenure within the first 2 years I was at Rutgers, and then I just did what I thought was most important to do.
And how many languages do you speak in?
I speak French, Spanish, and English. My French is probably a little rusty until I start speaking it again.
Mm-hmm.
I can read Portuguese pretty well. Mm-hmm. That's pretty helpful, at least for what I've been doing.
Oh, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
And just, not only do you have, you must have the sight ability to read these documents that are sometimes very faint.
Mm-hmm.
When I met you, after you published Africans in Colonial Louisiana, and I started the River Road African American Museum, there was no internet.
Oh no, that was I still have. I was just looking through my files and I saw a lot of faxes.
Yeah, fax. I think we were maybe beyond ditto machines.
Yeah.
But certainly there was no email, there was no World Wide Web.
Right.
And I want to say just thank you for encouraging me, not just me, but so many people you have inspired, scholars, young historians. Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate this appreciation, but before we stop, I have a history with Ascension Parish. I used to go there when I was a child. My mother's best friend had married this rich sugar planter. They lived in Pankerville.
Oh, Pankerville, down the bayou. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we used to go there, and I have a chapter in there, I think, a part of a chapter about sugar country. It's called Sugar Country.
Why is Ascension and Point Coupee specifically so important to the history of Louisiana and in regards to this documentation?
Well, first of all, the French were very concerned about, and more the Spanish than the French. They were interested in where their slaves came from. And they had their own stereotypes about what kind of slaves they wanted and what kind they didn't want. Now, like I found one document in there, selling a slave, and it was written, "We don't know what his ethnicity is, but we guarantee he is not an Igbo."
And why was that so significant that he not be Igbo?
Because the Igbos had a reputation for hanging themselves.
Rather than be enslaved. And what did you find about these people of different African ethnicities in Point Coupee?
Well, it was just very strange because they were always heavily Senegambia, right? Senegal. They call them guineas sometimes. And so this was unusual because it wasn't like that in other places. And I have in one of my books I talk about this question of ethnicity and why there were clustering of ethnicities in certain places. And in Louisiana they seemed to want to bring people who spoke the same language as the slaves who were already there, you know. And that was just one reason they had stereotypes about slaves. They thought that the Mandingo were very strong, but they were also rebellious. And there was a high proportion of people from West Africa up there in Point Coupé. And I think that that had a big impact on the rebelliousness of the slaves, because even the slave trade ships coming from that region, there was a very high percentage of slave revolts aboard the ships.
We're going to close. The records at Point Coupé and Ascension, you expressed to me that they're very important to preserve.
Yes, they are, indeed.
And why are they so important to preserve?
Because there's very few documents about slavery that have tell you so much about the slaves as people anywhere in the world. And only, I won't say only in Louisiana, but from what I've seen, I haven't seen anything like these. And these particular parishes along the Mississippi River, they were especially interesting and rich and detailed.
What is it that you would like to accomplish? You have so many accomplishments. As I see here, you were knighted. What year was that in France?
It was 1997.
Your son jokingly made reference to Joan of Arc. And I asked, are you the only female in France to have knight?
Well, no, this was a special kind of knight for people who were not French.
Okay.
So it was not people in France.
Well, that's certainly an honor, but what would be, I mean, just about every historical organization, all of the major universities in the United States, you have awards. What is the one thing you would like to accomplish before you leave this earth?
Okay, well, I've spent the last almost 20 years trying to expand these slave databases internationally, and so that they can communicate with each other and talk to each other, so that practically all the slaves will be in cyberspace, and we can talk to them, and these were people who, when I grew up, nobody was supposed to talk about. And so that to me is an achievement. And now that you and Angelica and Angelique have been talking to me about working on a really good platform and completing the slave databases for your parishes, then I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to do this.
Well, thank you so much, Gwen, for having us, Dr. Bidlow Hall.
Oh,
thank you so much for having us
here. Well,
here.
you're a very valued old friend to me.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the work you've done.
Thank you so much.